A nanny blew bubbles to calm a little boy, unaware that a millionaire dad was quietly watching. And Lucas Walsh was 7 years old, the age when a child should be chattering endlessly, singing along to cartoon jingles, or asking why about every cloud in the sky. But Lucas didn't speak. It had been 2 years since the last time he called out Mama, and 2 years since Emily, his mother, was killed in a car accident just blocks from their home. The modern house in suburban Portland was now wrapped in a near-total silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind born from absence, the kind that presses in on the walls and settles into the seams. Ethan Walsh, Lucas's father, had once been a celebrated architect, known for iconic structures and a belief that every problem could be solved with the right blueprint. But grief doesn't follow design. After Emily's death, Ethan closed his architecture office and started working from home, not out of a noble desire to be closer to his son, but because he couldn't bear walking into an empty house one more time. He was always home, yet rarely present. Lucas spent his days building Lego castles, piece by piece, in silence, a miniature architect in his own world. Ethan often stood at a distance, watching his son like one might watch a world they were no longer allowed to enter. And then that day came, the day when everything began to shift. It arrived as quietly as all the others. The soft morning light filtered through the wide glass windows, casting blurred shadows of tree branches across the polished floor. Seated in the middle of a plush rug, Lucas quietly pieced together a Lego freight train. No sound but the click of plastic bricks. No greeting, no eye contact. Ethan stood in the doorway of his home office, watching his son. He held a cup of coffee, steam rising gently, though his eyes carried the exhaustion of a sleepless night. "Lucas," he spoke softly, careful not to startle. "I'm free this morning. If you'd like, we could rebuild that castle you made last week." Lucas didn't answer. He simply shook his head, slight, firm, and final, without looking up. Lucas remained silent, reaching for another Lego piece as if Ethan wasn't even there. From the kitchen doorway, Julia, their longtime nanny, stepped in, her face lined with quiet concern. "He had breakfast but barely touched it," she said. "He's been eating less and the nightmares are back." "About Emily?" Ethan asked, eyes heavy. Julia nodded. "I think so. He wakes up crying but won't let me comfort him. Just curls up tighter." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration rising like a tide. As an architect, he'd once designed buildings that made the covers of magazines. He'd led teams, solved engineering puzzles under pressure. But here, in his own living room, faced with his own child, he felt like a man staring at a door with no handle, unable to knock, unable to enter. The morning passed in near silence, just the ticking of a wall clock and the soft clink of Lego bricks. Near noon, the doorbell rang, a rare sound in a house too quiet for too long. Julia wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it. On the doorstep stood a woman in her early 30s, her brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She wore a simple button-up shirt and gray slacks. Nothing fancy, but her smile was warm and luminous, brightening the entryway more than the sun behind her. "Good morning," she said kindly. "I'm Grace Miller from the Family Care Service. I'm assigned to help around the house today." "Nice to meet you. I'm Julia," the nanny replied. "You arrived right on time." "And this is Lucas," Julia added as they stepped inside. 7 years old, very smart, just a bit shy with new faces. Grace took in the home, neat, cold, and museum quiet. Her gaze paused in the living room where Lucas was focused on stacking colorful towers out of Lego bricks. She tilted her head slightly. "Wow, that's quite the creation," she said naturally, her voice sincere rather than patronizing. "Is that a fortress you're building?" Lucas looked up. His eyes met Grace's, for the first time that day, and perhaps for the first time in months, with someone other than Julia or Ethan. For a split second, it looked like he might say something, but then he lowered his gaze and continued building. "You're very creative," Grace added, keeping a respectful distance. Then she gently knelt, her gaze level with his. "When I was little, I used to love building things too. My mom said I had an engineer's hands." Lucas glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Grace didn't touch his toys. She didn't interrupt his rhythm. She was simply present. Julia nudged Grace Miller to keep walking. As they walked away, Grace whispered, "Why doesn't Lucas talk?" "His mother passed away 2 years ago," Julia replied softly. "He hasn't spoken since. Mr. Ethan has tried everything." "How does he communicate?" Grace asked. "Through gestures? Sometimes he draws." Grace felt her heart sink. In the following hours, Grace worked while constantly keeping an eye on Lucas. She noticed that the boy played alone, avoided every attempt Julia made to engage with him, and remained on edge, as if he were always afraid something bad might happen. About 2 hours later, while Grace was mopping near the entryway, a sound echoed from the living room, not loud, but sharp and sudden. Crash. Then, complete silence. Grace dropped the mop and hurried toward the noise. Julia, who'd also heard it, came running just behind her. The sight that met them stopped both women in their tracks. Lucas sat motionless on the rug, surrounded by hundreds of scattered Lego pieces. The castle he had carefully built all morning, completely destroyed. No screams, no tantrum. Just silent tears streaming down his cheeks, falling onto the fractured plastic bricks. "Lucas?" Julia called gently. "Are you okay?" No response. The boy sat frozen, eyes locked on the ruins of the world he'd just created. "Must have been a draft from the window," Julia whispered to Grace. "It happens sometimes. He'll be fine." But Grace looked at Lucas and knew. He wasn't fine. That castle wasn't just a toy. It was the only thing Lucas could control in a world that had stopped making sense. And now even that was gone. Grace didn't ask questions. She didn't say much. She simply sat beside him, close but not too close, and quietly reached into her cleaning bag. Julia watched, puzzled. Grace pulled out a small bottle of dish soap, poured a bit into a plastic lid, dipped it in some water, and gently blew a bubble. It floated upward, catching the sunlight from the window. One bubble, then another, and another, soft, silent, unexpectedly beautiful in the heavy air. Lucas looked up. He stopped crying. His eyes, still puffy, were now fixed on the bubbles dancing in the golden afternoon light. The bubbles kept drifting, light as breath, gliding gently through the air. They caught the sunlight and fractured it into delicate colors, blues, purples, pinks, shimmering like fleeting dreams. Grace remained seated, saying nothing, blowing bubble after bubble with slow, deliberate care, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. Lucas watched each one float. He wasn't crying anymore, but he didn't speak. A large bubble drifted close to him, and with a slow, almost reverent motion, he reached out and touched it. Pop. A soft burst, barely audible. But in that moment, Lucas's lips lifted ever so slightly. A smile. Small, shy, fragile, but real. From the hallway, a figure stood still. Ethan had come home earlier than expected. He'd paused when he heard quiet laughter from Julia and murmured words from a voice he didn't recognize. And then he saw his son was smiling. Ethan stood frozen, as if time itself had stopped. He didn't dare step forward, afraid that even the sound of a footfall might shatter the delicate moment. His son, the boy he hadn't been able to reach in 2 years, was smiling because of a bubble. Grace blew another, then another. Lucas slowly stood, never taking his eyes off the floating orbs. And then He began to reach for them, one by one, gently, as if afraid to break them with the weight of his own heart. Ethan stayed at the doorway, watching silently. A part of him, the part that had died with Emily, suddenly stirred back to life. Ethan stood motionless in the doorway for several minutes, barely breathing. He watched his son tiptoe after the bubbles, those small hands reaching toward joy, drifting through the golden afternoon light. Each time Lucas giggled, even the faintest giggle, it cracked Ethan's heart a little more, but it cracked open. "Look," Grace whispered, pointing to a large bubble spinning in the air. "It's dancing, Lucas." Lucas laughed, a real laugh this time, small but clear, like a drop falling into a still pond. Ethan flinched. How long had it been since he'd heard that sound? 2 years? Longer? "Mr. Walsh," Julia whispered, startled to see him. "I didn't know you were home." "Just got here," Ethan said, eyes still fixed on his son. What's happening?" His voice broke on the last word. "His castle fell," Julia explained, "and Grace?" She started blowing bubbles to comfort him. And it's working," Ethan murmured. Lucas reached for a bubble, lost his balance, and plopped onto the rug. But this time, he didn't cry, didn't get frustrated. He laughed, threw his head back and laughed like it was the first time falling didn't feel like failing. Ethan had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. His son was laughing freely. "Lucas," Grace said gently, "would you like to try blowing a bubble?" Lucas nodded eagerly. Grace handed him a plastic wand and showed him how. The first tries made only messy soap splashes. But Lucas didn't give up. He pressed his lips tight, focused hard, tried again. And then a tiny bubble appeared. Lucas clapped silently, eyes glowing. "Perfect," Grace praised. "You're a bubble artist." At that moment, Lucas turned toward the doorway. His eyes met Ethan's. His body tensed. The smile disappeared. Grace noticed. "Lucas," she said softly, "what if we teach your dad how to do it too? You're so good now, you could be the teacher." Lucas looked at Grace, then at Ethan. A pause. Then, slowly, he nodded. Just a small nod, but for Ethan, it was a door beginning to open. Ethan turned to Grace. "Can I ask, what did you do to make my son smile?" Grace looked at Lucas, then at Ethan. She saw raw emotion on the father's face. "His tower collapsed, so I thought, sometimes when something breaks, instead of trying to fix it, maybe we can create something new. My grandmother used to teach me to blow bubbles when I was sad." "Grace, when you were sad, what would your mother say to comfort you?" The question carried all the pain of a father who didn't know how to comfort his own child. "Mr. Walsh, may I be honest with you?" "Please do." "Sometimes it's not words, but presence that makes a child feel safe enough to be sad." "What do you mean?" "When Lucas was upset about the tower, I didn't try to cheer him up. I just stayed, so that if he wanted, I could offer him something new. And if he didn't, I'd sit there and be sad with him." Ethan looked at his son, who was now blowing bubbles, more confident than before. "Grace, can I ask something a little personal?" "Of course." "Can you teach me how to do that, how to make bubbles, and how to connect with my son?" Grace was moved by his sincerity. "You love Lucas more than anything in this world. He knows that." "But I'm not sure. I tell him every day, but he never answers." "He does, not with words, but with actions." "Like what?" "Look at him. He's playing. He's relaxed. That means he feels safe. And when children feel safe, they play. And when they play, they're just kids again." Ethan nodded, as if understanding that for the first time. Why does my son feel relaxed around you, but not me?" "Sir, may I ask, how do you usually communicate with Lucas?" "I ask about his day, what he wants to do, if he needs anything. but when he doesn't respond, I get frustrated. I repeat the question, sometimes louder, thinking maybe he didn't hear me. And then he shuts down even more. Grace nodded with compassion. Lucas doesn't need to speak to communicate. He shows you through actions. If he comes close, it means he misses you. If he shows you something he made, it means he wants to share. If he accepts a hug, it means he needs tenderness. But I want to hear his voice. That will come, but first he needs to feel safe enough to speak. So, what should I do? Don't push, just be there, like you are now. At that moment, Lucas walked over with an empty bubble bottle. All out? Grace asked. Lucas nodded. Want me to make more? She asked gently. Lucas nodded again, then looked toward his father. The afternoon faded into the gentle light of evening. After blowing dozens of bubbles with Grace and Ethan, Lucas sat down on the floor, out of breath but eyes still shining. In his hands was a worn paperback book Julia had found while tidying his room. I think this used to be his favorite, Julia said, handing it to Grace. It was placed on the pillow like something precious. Grace held the book, settling beside Lucas. Would you like to read this? Lucas didn't answer. He clutched the book to his chest like a sacred object, then looked up at Grace and turned toward Ethan. This is the book your mom used to read, isn't it? Ethan asked softly. Lucas nodded, slow and sure. He opened the book on his lap and turned to the first page. It was a story about a little rabbit who had lost his voice and had to travel through strange forests to find it again and save his family. Ethan moved in closer, and as Lucas pointed to the first line, Ethan began reading. Once upon a time. Lucas nodded and flipped the page. Ethan kept reading line by line while Lucas followed closely, eyes locked on every word like he was retracing a forgotten path through memory. Then they reached a page midway through where the little rabbit finally found his voice and cried out for help. Lucas paused. His hands trembled slightly. He looked at the page, then at Ethan. Then he looked up at Grace. His lips moved. Grace held her breath. Lucas, she whispered. And then a voice, soft as wind, whispered out, fragile but clear. Mama. The room stopped. The world held its breath. Mama used to read this, Lucas said again, this time a little louder, his eyes glassy with tears. Ethan broke. The tears he had held back for 2 long years came pouring down like a dam burst. He wrapped his arms around Lucas, carefully, tenderly, as if cradling his own heart reborn. Yes, my love, Ethan choked. She used to read this to you. She loved seeing you laugh when the bunny hid under the leaves, and she loved you so much. Lucas leaned into his father's shoulder. 2 years of silence vanished with a single word, and a heart brave enough to speak again. After that night, something miraculous began to unfold, bit by bit. Lucas didn't talk much. In truth, he still hardly spoke at all. But now, every glance, every nod, every crayon scribble or gentle touch on the arm was a sentence of its own. And Ethan, the man who once believed love must be spoken, was learning something new. Sometimes silence is the loudest way a child knows how to speak. Grace continued coming each day, but now she was more than just the house help. She was someone Ethan trusted, someone Lucas turned to when he wanted to laugh, to build, or simply to sit in quiet beside someone who understood. One morning, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, watching Lucas color intently. On the page was a house. Outside it stood 3 figures, 1 tall adult, 1 medium-sized woman with long hair, and 1 child blowing bubbles. Lucas, Ethan said softly, is this our house? Lucas nodded, eyes still on the page. Ethan leaned in to see better. The tall adult wore glasses and a tie, clearly him. The woman had long hair and a big smile, Grace, and the child was Lucas, holding a bubble wand. Ethan felt something twist in his chest. "Lucas, are you drawing our family?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper, afraid to shatter the fragile truth before him. This time, Lucas looked up. He met his father's eyes and nodded again. Ethan inhaled deeply. In Lucas's gaze, he no longer saw fear or distance. Instead, he saw something warm. Trust. "You drew Grace," Ethan said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You want her to be part of our family, don't you?" Lucas glanced at Grace, who was quietly wiping down the table across the room, then turned back. Another firm nod. For a child who had lived in silence, each nod was a paragraph. Ethan stood, walked over to Grace. "Grace," he said gently, "thank you, not just for the bubbles, for teaching me how to listen." Grace looked at him, eyes misty. "I didn't really do anything special, Mr. Walsh." "That's exactly it," he said. "You didn't try to fix him. You were just there. And sometimes that's the most important thing." Since the day Lucas drew the three-person family picture, something subtle but undeniable had begun to shift in the house. Lucas became more proactive. He didn't just nod or shake his head anymore. He would take Ethan's hand and lead him to the Lego corner, placing a toy in his palm like a silent invitation. He began to share space, something that had once seemed impossible. One late afternoon, Ethan sat on the floor, building a small car under Lucas's quiet instruction. The boy said nothing, fully focused, but every time Ethan placed a piece correctly, Lucas clapped lightly and smiled. No words were spoken, but joy filled the room like sunlight. "I think this car would go well with your dinosaur set," Ethan said softly. Lucas nodded, but instead of going back to building, he took a dinosaur figure and placed it on the car. Ethan watched, then asked gently, "Are you taking the dinosaur for a ride?" Lucas didn't respond right away. He stood up, walked to the toy shelf, and pulled out 3 stuffed animals: a father bear, a mother bear, and a baby bear. He arranged all 3 on the newly built car. Ethan froze. "It's a family," he said. Lucas turned back, his eyes bright. He nodded firmly. Ethan felt breathless. This wasn't just pretend play. It was a quiet metaphor. Lucas was expanding his safety circle, letting his father in, no longer keeping him on the outside. "You want the whole family to go for a ride?" Ethan asked. Lucas ran to the window, pulled back the curtain, and pointed outside, where the lawn glowed gold under the evening sun. "Right now?" Ethan asked, surprised. Lucas turned, gave another nod, this one full of excitement. 20 minutes later, Ethan and Lucas were in the car, a small tote bag holding a bottle of dish soap and a bubble wand resting in the back seat. Grace's gentle suggestion, "If he feels nervous or overwhelmed, the bubbles might help." Popped. It was the first time in 2 years that Ethan and Lucas were going somewhere, just the 2 of them. At the park, sunlight spilled gently over the grass. Children laughed around the playground. Lucas held tightly to Ethan's hand as they stepped out. But he didn't pull away. That alone made Ethan's throat tighten. "You can play whatever you want," Ethan whispered. "I'll be right here." Lucas scanned the area. He slowly made his way toward the slide. Ethan stayed a few steps behind, giving him space. Lucas placed his hand on the ladder, then turned to look back, just to make sure his father was still there. Ethan smiled and nodded. And then, Lucas climbed, one step at a time. Ethan held his breath. Lucas reached the top, sat at the edge, and slid down. And as he did, a burst of laughter came out of him, clear and loud, like the ringing of a bell on the first day of spring. Other kids stopped to look. Ethan stood frozen, tears streaming freely. He didn't care who saw. That was the first real laugh he'd heard from his son since the day Emily died. Lucas ran back and hugged him tight, small arms wrapping around his waist. "I love you, Lucas," Ethan whispered, bending down to return the embrace. More than anything, Lucas didn't respond with words, but the grip of that hug said everything. Ethan realized now that the language of the heart had begun to replace the language of the mouth, and it was no less true. That afternoon, sunlight spilled gently across the living room floor, sketching golden lines along the rug. The house was quiet, not the heavy silence of grief, but the peaceful kind, like it was finally breathing in rhythm with the people inside it. Lucas entered the room carrying a familiar, worn book in his arms. Its corners were bent, its pages a little wrinkled from use, but the spark in his eyes made it look like treasure. Ethan was tidying some sketches on the table. When he saw Lucas, he smiled softly. "You want to read, buddy?" Lucas nodded, then held the book out toward his dad, but this time not just to be read to. He pointed to a line on the first page and looked up at Ethan. "You want to read with me?" Lucas didn't nod right away. Instead, he glanced back toward the kitchen where Grace was rinsing mugs. He looked at her for a moment, then turned back, tapping gently on the middle cushion of the couch between two empty spots. Ethan understood. "You want Grace to read with us?" Lucas gave a firm, clear nod. Minutes later, the three of them sat on the couch, Ethan on the left, Grace on the right, and Lucas nestled in between, holding the book like a sacred thing. Ethan opened the cover, voice gentle and low. Once upon a time, there was a little rabbit who had lost his voice. Grace chimed in with character voices, chirpy birds, grumpy owls, earning giggles from Lucas. He wasn't just listening, he was engaged, pointing to characters, sometimes whispering words under his breath, following along with the story. Ethan watched him, heart aching in the best way. The boy who had once been silent was now present, with his eyes, with his hands, with his heart. When they reached the part where the bunny finds his voice and calls out to his family, Lucas shifted slightly. He turned toward Ethan, looked at him for a few seconds, then whispered, "I love you, Dad." Time seemed to stop. The words were so soft, Ethan almost didn't believe them. But the look in Lucas's eyes was unmistakable, pure, unafraid, real. Ethan pressed a hand to his chest, voice trembling. "I love you, more than all the stars in the sky." It was the phrase Emily had used every night. Lucas smiled, then turned to Grace, his eyes glowing with hope. "Do you love me too?" he asked, his voice clear and certain. Grace froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was the first time Lucas had ever asked her a question like that. She steadied herself, eyes shining. "I love you, like you were my own son." Lucas didn't say anything, but he leaned against her shoulder, his father's heartbeat on one side, Grace's warmth on the other. They kept reading, page by page, taking turns, pausing now and then to laugh or breathe or simply be. When they reached the last line, no one moved. No one needed to, because in that moment, without a single word more, they all knew. This was family, not because of blood, but because they had chosen each other, chosen love, presence, and healing. Together. One spring morning, while the breeze still carried the sweetness of new blossoms, Ethan sat at his desk with a blank sheet in front of him. Not a blueprint or work memo, but a sketch for something greater than any design he'd ever drafted. Across from him, Lucas was coloring a ring. He used a blue marker to fill in the stone, concentrating as if it were a real gem. "Do you think Grace will like it?" Lucas asked, eyes full of anticipation. Ethan smiled and winked. "If she doesn't, we'll just have to come up with an even better plan." Lucas giggled. The plan to propose, and this time it was a plan made by both father and son. They'd been preparing for weeks. Lucas made a handmade card. Ethan folded paper into hearts. They chose the perfect spot, the corner of the backyard garden where Grace often sat blowing bubbles with Lucas. The place where, though no one said it aloud, love had quietly begun. That evening, Grace came home from her youth art class. As she walked into the kitchen, Ethan stood there in a white shirt holding a bouquet of wildflowers, purple, white, and blue, the same colors Lucas had picked the day he smiled again for the first time. "What's going on, Mr. Walsh?" she teased, raising an eyebrow. "You'll only call me that until you say yes," Ethan replied, voice warm and steady. Grace blinked. Before she could respond, Lucas stepped from around the corner, holding a tiny ring box in both hands. On the lid, in childlike handwriting, were the letters G+E. "Miss Grace," Lucas said, his voice trembling slightly, "will you marry my dad, so we won't be missing anyone anymore?" Grace brought a hand to her mouth. Tears welled up, not from surprise, but because everything was so right, so full, so real. Ethan stepped forward, knelt down, and opened the box. "You didn't just change Lucas's life. You saved both of us. I don't have perfect words, but I promise you presence. I promise heart. I promise love for the rest of my life." Grace didn't speak right away. She knelt, hugged Lucas tight, first, then turned to Ethan, tears streaming. "Yes," she whispered. 3 months later, on a mild summer afternoon, they held a small wedding in the garden, beneath the canopy of trees where Lucas once caught his first smile, in a bubble. No grand altar, no booming music, just birdsong, sunlight through leaves, and the quiet beauty of love arriving in its own time. Lucas led Grace down the aisle. He wore a little white shirt, held a flower basket instead of a ring pillow, and grinned the entire time. Ethan stood in a simple suit, eyes shining. Not from grief this time, but from joy, reborn. As they exchanged vows, a soft breeze drifted by. And then, bubbles appeared, floating through the air, delicately, magically, blown by Lucas himself from behind a tree. "I remember," Lucas whispered. "Bubbles always made me feel safe." Ethan knelt, touched his forehead to his son's. "You are safe now, Lucas. We all are." When the applause came, when the rings were placed, when the three of them embraced beneath the sun-dappled leaves, their story didn't end. It simply opened its next chapter. After that simple summer wedding beneath the trees, everything seemed to slow down. Not because anything was missing, but because they had found enough and no longer needed to rush. The house didn't change much. The same old couch where they read stories. The wooden table with a small crack where Lucas once painted their first family portrait. The tiny glass jar of bubble soap still rested in its corner. But the air felt warmer, lighter, filled with laughter. Ethan learned how to make breakfast. Nothing fancy, just golden toast, fresh orange juice, and a smile that never left his face when he watched Lucas dart through the house. Grace kept teaching her art class, but now she always came home on time, never flustered, never drained. Because the place she called home now had two people waiting, not just with eyes, but with arms ready to hold her close. Lucas changed the most. The boy who once lived in silence now never stopped telling stories. One afternoon, he tugged Ethan outside to point at a bee. "See that one? It's looking for a friend, just like I used to." Ethan had to pause, heart clenching. Sometimes a child's words carry more weight than any speech ever could. As autumn arrived, the first golden leaves fell. Lucas gathered them one by one and taped them to the fridge. "So, you and Mom know the season's changing." Then one day, in the kitchen, Grace placed a hand gently over her belly and looked at Ethan. "I think we might be getting ready for another season." Ethan blinked, slowly catching on. "Are you sure?" Grace nodded. Her eyes glowed with the same light Ethan once saw the day Lucas smiled again. Lucas, as if tuned to any whisper of change, came running from the next room. "What's happening?" Ethan knelt down. "Lucas, you're going to be a big brother." Lucas froze. Then his face lit up. "Really? Like really real?" Grace pulled him into her arms. "The baby's right here, but it's still very, very small. We have to wait a few months." Lucas leaned in, placing his ear against her belly. He listened, eyes wide. "I don't hear anything," he whispered, "but I'll start telling stories now, so when the baby comes, they'll already know this house is filled with love." And so began a new rhythm, a season of quiet love, gently expanding. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady presence and happiness blooming little by little like a flower in the backyard garden.